The tension over Ukraine is now reaching new heights all the way into orbit. One of Russia's deputy prime ministers says Russia will stop letting the United States use Russian-made rockets to launch military satellites because those economic penalties the United States has slapped on Moscow. See, you do to us, we'll do to you. He also said Russia will quit working with the United States to run the International Space Station after the year 2020. That's what he says. That's 4 years earlier than the White House had requested. A NASA spokesman says Russia has not notified the agency of any changes. So now this is official. But since the United States ended the shuttle program because we ran out of money, remember? American astronauts have had to hitch rides on Russian spacecraft. NASA officials say they're working with private companies to change that, possibly in the next few years. Either way, space is supposed to be about science. It almost never gets dragged into politics. In fact, the space station itself is a symbol of cooperation between the United States and Russia after the Cold War. And just today, American, Russian, and Japanese astronauts landed safely back on Earth after spending 6 months there. Ugh, 6 months. Can you imagine? If this keeps up, though, there is no way to know how long that cooperation might last.
Well, Russia now retaliating for U.S. sanctions over Ukraine, this time in space. Moscow is announcing that as of 2020, it will no longer participate in the International Space Station. That almost certainly means the space station experiment will end.
Russia is retaliating for American sanctions over Ukraine with a move that could ground the U.S. space program. Our chief national security correspondent, Jim Sciutto, has been looking into this. What are you seeing?
Well, this is an example of what's happening in eastern Ukraine has an impact far beyond the internal politics of Eastern Europe, because, we forget that the U.S. space program today relies on Russia to get to the International Space Station and to launch some military satellites. Now, Russia is threatening, in effect, to ground American astronauts and satellites in retaliation for those economic sanctions, scuttling decades of what had been very promising U.S.-Russian cooperation in space.
Given a final farewell again.
They were all smiles in the International Space Station this week, but could this be one of the last times that American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts journeyed together through space?
And the International Space Station.
Russian officials are taking the battle over Ukraine into orbit, vowing to abandon the space station 4 years early in 2020.
And lift off.
And banning Russian-made rocket engines to launch U.S. military satellites. The deputy prime minister even suggested astronauts instead use a trampoline.
The final liftoff of Atlantis.
And this is no small problem, because since NASA retired the shuttle in 2011, American astronauts have no other way up or down than hitching rides on Russian rockets.
The Russian announcement really means we need to rethink our reliance on them, because it shows we are dependent on them in ways that might have made sense 10 years ago but doesn't make sense anymore.
Well, you do the talking, Moscow.
The U.S.-Russian space partnership has thrived for decades, one of the most visible symbols of détente during the Cold War and the new peace after the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was very much a win-win. The U.S. saved billions on the shuttle. Russia made billions as a high-tech taxi service.
Okay, copy that.
U.S. officials express hope the Russian threat is just bluster.
We've had a long cooperation on our space program with the Russians, and we're hopeful that will continue. We still continue to cooperate on a range of issues.
It is most likely that the U.S. will depend on private space companies such as SpaceX to develop new space vehicles to transport American astronauts to the space station. And as for Russian engines used to launch U.S. satellites, the U.S. has stockpiled engines that supply good for about 2 years of launches. That is some coverage, but you talk to a lot of analysts, and it is a reminder that they need a longer-term solution here. You cancel the space shuttle, you have these brewing tensions with Russia that don't seem like they're going in a good direction. They got to find a better way to get up to space.
Serious problem.
Yeah.
Well, we begin tonight with the news that a Russian Proton rocket with an advanced satellite on board has crashed after liftoff. Russia launched the rocket with the mission of lofting the Express AM-4R telecommunications satellite into orbit. That launch took place at a space center in Kazakhstan. But in its third stage of liftoff, there was an unspecified failure. Russian publication RIA Novosti says the rocket could have crashed over the Altai Mountains or the Pacific Ocean, but its whereabouts are still undetermined. However, on a positive note, so far there are no reports of major damage or casualties. We'll continue to follow the story and bring you updates.
Thomas, glad to have you with us. We start with breaking news this hour. A Russian Proton-M rocket carrying a communication satellite has crashed just minutes after takeoff. No casualties or damage on the ground has been reported so far. Let's cross live now to our correspondent Marina Kosarova for the latest. Marina, thank you very much for being with us. Tell us, what do we know so far about this incident?
Well, Sean, preliminary reports suggest that it suffered an engine failure. Mission Control lost track of the rocket 9 minutes into its flight. And also, that's when it was during the third stage of the launch, in fact. Now, Proton-M was supposed to carry a Russian communications satellite into orbit. That's estimated to be worth over $28 million. In fact, it's Russia's most advanced and powerful satellite. So this is quite a pricey accident. Considering the situation, all upcoming launches have been suspended from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan until they figure out the cause of the accident. A special state commission has been set up to investigate this. Also, latest reports claim that the rocket is now in a non-intended orbit and that fragments could be seen anywhere at this point, because the rocket, when it crashed over Siberia between Altai and the Pacific Ocean. So that's quite a vast area to cover. And again, we're monitoring the situation, and as we know more, we will report on it.
All right. Now, thank you. The rocket launch had started out as planned. And as you can see here, we have some different stages of the Proton-M rocket launch. Let's see if we can take a look at those right now. All right, here we are. Okay, so the three different stages of the launch with the booster rockets separating off. You can see them here. Now, the failure occurred in this third stage right here. This is where Mission Control lost track of that vehicle. An expert commission has held an urgent meeting to establish the cause of the accident at this time.
Well, Russia now retaliating for U.S. sanctions over Ukraine, this time in space. Moscow is announcing that as of 2020, it will no longer participate in the International Space Station. That almost certainly means the space station experiment will end. Phil Keating is live in Miami with more huge news here. The International Space Station, has 6 years left, Phil?
Yeah, almost certainly that it will be the case if Russia does deliver on this threat announced yesterday. 13 years old, $100 billion invested, 15 participating nations, but in all practical senses, without Russia's cooperation, the space station as we know it dies. NASA budgets about $3 billion every year funding the space station and all the science up there. The U.S. wants to keep it going and alive until at least 2024. But the Russian side has the thrusters, which keep it in orbit and a proper attitude. The U.S. side controls the solar arrays, i.e. the power source. So really it takes both nations to keep it safe and operational. NASA's reaction so far, cautious. Quote, ongoing operations on the ISS continue on a normal basis. We have not received any official notification from the government of Russia on any changes in our space cooperation at this point. Of course, U.S. astronauts rely on the Russians to get up to the space station. That contract's good through 2017 and not affected by those moves from Moscow yesterday.
Phil Keating in Miami. Just unbelievable that thing potentially could just burn up, but we'll see. 6 years is a long time away, I guess. Thanks, Phil.
The tension over Ukraine is now reaching new heights all the way into orbit. One of Russia's deputy prime ministers says Russia will stop letting the United States use Russian-made rockets to launch military satellites because those economic penalties the United States has slapped on Moscow. See, you do to us, we'll do to you.
A Russian rocket carrying a communications satellite has crashed just minutes after liftoff. Luckily, no casualties or damage on the ground are reported. Russia's Federal Space Agency has confirmed that the Proton-M burned up in the dense layers of the atmosphere, but it says that some very small fragments could have reached the ground. Now, the rocket launch had started out as planned. You can see here the different stages of a Proton-M rocket flight with booster rockets separating it. Now, the failure occurred during the third stage, and mission control lost track of the vehicles. An expert commission has been set up to establish why the launch went so wrong. Let's get more on this from RT's Medina Kochneva, who joins us now. Medina, this is a pretty expensive accident, isn't it?
Yes, it's true. This is quite a pricing accident indeed, as we know that the Proton-M rocket was carrying a Russian communication satellite into the orbit, and that particular satellite is estimated to be worth around $28 million. We also know that it is actually Russia's most advanced and most powerful satellite. Now, in terms of what caused the accident, at the moment, Russian Space Agency says that there was an emergency engine shutdown. Moreover, the Mission Control Center also lost track of the vehicle 9 minutes into its flight. Now, that's exactly when the rocket was in the third stage of its launch, and that's when the crash happened. Now, there are so far no reports of damage or casualties resulting from the rocket failure. The rocket itself burned up in the thick layers of the atmosphere. However, experts say that some of its fragments could have fallen between Altai and the Pacific Ocean. Now, all of its fuel also burned up in the atmosphere, including the toxic components that are used to power the Proton-M rocket. Now, currently, all upcoming launches from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, which is located in Kazakhstan, have been suspended until they figure out what caused the accident.
RT's Medina Kochneva, giving us a breakdown of what had happened there. Thank you.